I walked away from my rich family with nothing, and I've never regretted it. They gave me an ultimatum: their money and control, or my own life. I chose freedom, and paid the price for it. My name is Vanessa, I'm 39 years old, and 5 years ago I made the most difficult decision of my life. I walked away from my family with nothing but a suitcase of clothes, a few $100s in my bank account, and the determination to build a life on my own terms. I left behind financial security, family connections, a home I'd grown up in, and relationships I'd had since birth. People who hear this story often assume I must regret it, that I must have moments where I wish I'd stayed and found a way to make it work. But the truth is, even knowing how hard these past 5 years have been, even knowing what I've lost and what I've had to sacrifice, I would make the same choice again without hesitation. This is the story of why I left, what it cost me, and why I consider it the best decision I've ever made. I grew up in Orange County, California, in a family that was wealthy by any reasonable standard. My father, Richard, built a successful commercial real estate business over several decades, and my mother, Catherine, came from old money that gave our family even more financial cushion and social connections. I'm the middle child of 3, with an older brother named Preston who's 42 and a younger sister named Blair who's 36. From the outside, we looked like the perfect family. We lived in a beautiful house in an exclusive neighborhood, drove expensive cars, took lavish vacations, and moved in social circles where wealth and status were the primary currencies. My parents were pillars of the community, serving on boards of various charities and cultural institutions, hosting fundraisers and galas, and maintaining the image of successful, generous, well-connected people. But inside our home, behind closed doors, there was a different reality. My parents' marriage was cold and transactional, more of a business partnership than a loving relationship. They rarely showed affection toward each other and seemed to view their children primarily as extensions of their own ambitions and social standing rather than as individuals with our own dreams and identities. The expectations placed on all of us were suffocating. We were expected to excel academically but only in fields my parents approved of: business, law, medicine, nothing creative or unconventional. We were expected to socialize with the right people, date people from the right families, maintain the right image at all times. We were expected to be grateful for our privileged upbringing and to understand that this privilege came with obligations to the family and its reputation. My older brother Preston seemed to accept these expectations without much resistance. He went to the right schools, got his MBA, joined my father's business, and married a woman from another wealthy family. He and his wife had 2 children and lived in a house not far from our parents, maintaining close family ties and continuing the cycle. My younger sister Blair rebelled in her late teens and early 20s, dating people my parents didn't approve of and threatening to drop out of college. But eventually she was brought back into the fold, given a position at one of my mother's charity organizations, and set up with a trust fund that was contingent on her maintaining family relationships and living according to my parents' standards. I fell somewhere in between. I wasn't as compliant as Preston, but I wasn't as openly rebellious as Blair had been. I went to USC as expected and studied business as directed, even though my real interests were in art history and design. I worked for my father's company after graduation, taking a position in the marketing department that was created specifically for me. I dated people my parents approved of and attended all the family functions and social events I was expected to attend. But inside, I was deeply unhappy. I felt like I was living someone else's life, following a script that had been written for me before I was even born. Every decision was made with consideration of what my parents would think, what would maintain the family image, what would keep the peace and avoid disappointing anyone. I had no sense of who I really was or what I really wanted because I'd never been allowed to explore those questions. The breaking point began when I was 33 and met someone who changed my perspective on everything. His name was David, and he was an artist who'd been hired to create a sculpture for one of my mother's charity events. He was talented, passionate about his work, and completely uninterested in the world of wealth and status that I'd grown up in. He lived modestly in a small studio apartment, supported himself with his art and some teaching, and seemed genuinely happy with a life that my family would have considered a failure. We started talking at the charity event, and I was immediately drawn to his authenticity and his different perspective on life. He talked about art and creativity with a passion I'd never heard anyone express about anything. He asked me questions about what I cared about, what made me excited, what I dreamed of doing, questions no one in my family had ever asked because the answers were already predetermined. We started seeing each other secretly because I knew my parents would never approve of him. He didn't come from the right background, he didn't have money or connections, he made a living as an artist which my family would see as frivolous and unstable. For several months, I lived a double life, maintaining my role as the dutiful daughter and company employee while spending my free time with David, experiencing a freedom and authenticity I'd never felt before. David helped me see that the life I was living wasn't actually my life at all. He encouraged me to think about what I wanted, not what my parents wanted or what was expected of me. He introduced me to his friends, creative people who lived modestly but purposefully, who made choices based on passion and values rather than money and status. I started to realize that there was a whole different way of living, one where you could be happy without wealth, where you could define success on your own terms. I began to change in small ways. I started speaking up more in family settings, expressing opinions that differed from my parents' views. I started questioning some of the business practices at my father's company that I found ethically questionable. I started missing some of the social obligations I'd always attended without question. My parents noticed these changes and were not pleased. My mother made comments about me seeming different lately, and not in a good way. My father expressed disappointment that I wasn't showing more commitment to the family business. The situation came to a head when my family discovered my relationship with David. I'd been careless with my phone, and my mother saw some messages between us. She confronted me, and I admitted I'd been seeing someone. When she asked who, I made the mistake of being honest. I told her about David, about his work as an artist, about how much I cared about him. My mother's reaction was immediate and severe. She called my father, and together they told me that this relationship was unacceptable, that I was embarrassing the family, and that I needed to end it immediately. When I refused, they escalated their response. They threatened to cut me off financially, to remove me from the family business, to disinherit me. They said that if I continued this relationship, I was choosing to reject the family and everything they'd provided for me. I was shaken by their ultimatum but also angry. I was a 33-year-old woman, and my parents were trying to dictate who I could date as if I were a teenager. I told them that my relationship with David was my decision and that I wouldn't end it just because they disapproved. I thought they were bluffing about the consequences, that eventually they'd accept my choice even if they weren't happy about it. But my parents didn't bluff. Within a week, I was called into my father's office and told that my position at the company was being eliminated. I was given 2 weeks severance, which was insulting considering I'd worked there for years, and told that this was the consequence of my choices. My mother called to inform me that I was no longer welcome at family events and that my trust fund, which I'd been receiving monthly distributions from, was being restructured in a way that meant I'd receive nothing unless I met certain conditions, primarily ending my relationship with David. My siblings were brought into the situation to try to pressure me. Preston called to tell me I was being selfish and foolish, throwing away financial security and family relationships for a man I barely knew. Blair was more sympathetic but still urged me to end the relationship and repair things with our parents before the damage became permanent. I was facing a choice that felt impossible. On one side was my family, with all the financial security, connections, and stability that came with staying in their good graces. On the other side was my relationship with David and, more importantly, the freedom to make my own choices and live my own life. If I stayed with David, I'd lose everything my family provided. If I gave him up to appease my parents, I'd be accepting that I had no autonomy, that I'd always be controlled by their money and their expectations. I talked to David about the situation, and he said that he'd understand if I chose my family, that he didn't want to be the reason I lost my financial security and family relationships. But he also said that he couldn't be with someone who let others control her life, that what he loved about me was the person I was becoming, not the obedient daughter I'd been before we met. I spent weeks agonizing over the decision. I looked at my bank account and realized how dependent I'd been on my family's money. My salary from the company had been generous but was now gone. My trust fund distributions had covered my rent and most of my expenses. Without those sources of income, I had maybe 6 months of savings if I was very frugal. I'd never had to support myself completely on my own, and the prospect was terrifying. But I also thought about what my life would look like if I gave in to my parents' demands. I'd end my relationship with David and likely be paired off with someone from an approved family. I'd get my job back at the company or some equivalent position. I'd attend the same social events, maintain the same image, live the same life I'd been living. And I'd know, forever, that I'd chosen comfort over authenticity, that I'd let my parents' money buy my compliance. I made my decision on a Sunday afternoon, sitting alone in the apartment that I'd soon have to give up. I called my parents and told them that I respected their right to make choices about their money and their business, but that I was making my own choice about my life. I told them I wouldn't end my relationship with David and that I wouldn't compromise who I was or what I wanted to please them. I told them I loved them but that I needed to live my own life. My father's response was cold and final. He said that I was making the biggest mistake of my life and that I'd come to regret choosing a struggling artist over my family. He said that their door would always be open if I came to my senses and apologized, but that until then, I should consider myself on my own. My mother cried and said I was breaking her heart, but she didn't waver in supporting my father's ultimatum. Within a month, I'd moved out of my expensive apartment and into David's small studio. I'd sold my car, which I could no longer afford to maintain. I'd started looking for any job I could find that would pay my bills. My business degree from USC should have opened doors, but my only professional experience was working for my father's company, and when potential employers called for references, I can only imagine what they were told. I ended up taking a job as a receptionist at a design firm, making a fraction of what I'd earned before but grateful to have any income at all. I went from shopping at high-end stores without looking at prices to buying clothes at thrift shops and budgeting for groceries. I went from driving a luxury car to taking public transportation. I went from a spacious apartment to sharing a tiny studio with David where we had to be creative about storage and personal space. The first year was the hardest. I struggled with the loss of financial security and the practical challenges of living on a tight budget. I missed my family, or at least I missed the idea of family, the sense of belonging and connection even if that connection had come with unacceptable strings. I had moments of doubt where I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake, if I should swallow my pride and apologize to my parents so I could get my old life back. But I also experienced a freedom I'd never known before. For the first time in my life, I was making my own choices without considering what my parents would think. I was working a job I'd found on my own merit, living in a place I paid for with my own money, spending time with people I chose because I genuinely liked them rather than because they were from the right families or had the right connections. David and I had our struggles. Living together in a tiny space while both dealing with financial stress put pressure on our relationship. We had arguments about money, about space, about the future. But we also had something real, a partnership based on actual compatibility and shared values rather than on family approval or social expectations. About 18 months after I left my family, I was promoted to an administrative coordinator position at the design firm. It wasn't a huge salary increase, but it was a recognition of my work and my abilities independent of my family name. Around the same time, David sold a major sculpture to a corporate client, bringing in more money than he'd ever made from a single piece. We were able to move into a small one-bedroom apartment, and while it was still modest by any standard, it felt like a mansion compared to the studio we'd been sharing. I slowly built a new life. I made friends through work and through David's artistic community, people who knew nothing about my family background or the wealth I'd walked away from. I was just Vanessa, the woman who worked at the design firm and was dating an artist, not Vanessa from the wealthy real estate family. The anonymity was liberating. My siblings made occasional attempts to reach out. Preston sent some emails encouraging me to reconcile with our parents, emphasizing how much easier my life would be if I just apologized and came back to the family. Blair called a few times, more to check on me than to pressure me, but even she made it clear that she thought I should find a way to repair the relationship. I didn't respond to Preston's emails, and my conversations with Blair were brief and superficial. I didn't trust that anything I told them wouldn't be reported back to my parents, and I didn't want to engage in conversations that were designed to convince me I'd made the wrong choice. About 2 years after I left, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that my parents had told people I was going through a phase, that I'd made some poor choices but would eventually come around. They maintained the family image by being vague about my absence from family events, suggesting I was traveling or busy with work. They didn't tell people the truth, that they'd cut me off for refusing to end a relationship they didn't approve of, because that would have made them look controlling and unreasonable. Around the same time, my interest in design that I'd suppressed for so long started to re-emerge. I began taking evening classes in interior design, paying for them with money I'd saved carefully over months. I discovered I had a real talent for it and a passion that had been dormant during all those years of following my family's prescribed path. The design firm I worked for eventually let me start helping with some of their projects, and I began to build a portfolio. 3 years after leaving my family, I launched my own small interior design business. It was just me working out of our apartment, taking on small residential projects, but it was mine. I'd built it with my own skills and hard work, with no family connections or money to jumpstart it. Every client I landed, every project I completed, was a testament to my own abilities rather than to my family name. David and I got married in a simple ceremony with about 20 friends in attendance. No family from my side, just the chosen family we'd built together. My parents weren't invited and didn't know about the wedding until months later when Blair somehow found out and mentioned it in a tense phone conversation. My mother apparently cried when she learned she'd missed her daughter's wedding, but she still wouldn't reach out or admit that maybe their ultimatum had been wrong. My design business slowly grew. I got referrals from satisfied clients, built a reputation for creative solutions on modest budgets, and eventually was able to hire an assistant. The income still wasn't comparable to what I'd had when I was living off my family's money, but it was honest income that I'd earned, and that made it more valuable to me than any trust fund distribution had ever been. For years after leaving my family, I achieved something that felt incredibly significant. I'd saved enough money to make a down payment on a small condo. It wasn't in an exclusive neighborhood, it wasn't big or luxurious, but it was mine. David and I moved into our first owned home, a space we'd purchased with our own money through our own work, and I felt prouder of that modest condo than I'd ever felt about the mansion I'd grown up in. Around this time, Blair reached out with news that our father was having health problems. She said he'd had a minor heart attack and that it had made our parents reflect on family and mortality. She hinted that they might be open to reconciliation if I was willing to reach out. But she also made it clear that reconciliation would require me to acknowledge that I'd made mistakes, to show appropriate contrition for the pain I'd caused them. I thought about it carefully. Part of me wanted a relationship with my parents, wanted to heal the rift and have family connections again. But I also knew what reconciliation on their terms would mean. It would mean accepting their narrative that I'd been wrong to choose my own life, that I'd been foolish to walk away from their money and control. It would mean giving them power over me again, letting them believe that their approach had been justified all along. I wrote my parents a letter instead of calling. I told them I was sorry they'd had to deal with health scares and family stress. I told them I loved them and wished things could be different. But I also told them that I couldn't and wouldn't apologize for choosing to live my own life, for refusing to let them control my choices with money and ultimatums. I said that I'd be open to rebuilding a relationship if they could accept me as an autonomous adult who made her own decisions, but that I wouldn't pretend I'd been wrong to walk away. I never received a response to that letter. Blair later told me that my parents had read it but felt that it was insufficiently apologetic, that I was still being stubborn and prideful. The message was clear: reconciliation was available, but only if I admitted I'd been wrong and they'd been right. Since I wouldn't do that, the estrangement would continue. That was over a year ago, and the situation hasn't changed. I'm now 39, and I've been separated from my family for 5 years. I have no contact with my parents and only occasional, superficial contact with my siblings. I wasn't invited to family events, wasn't included in family photos, wasn't part of the family narrative they presented to their social circle. But I also have a life I'm genuinely proud of. My design business is thriving, and I'm working on projects I find meaningful and creative. David and I have a strong marriage built on mutual respect and shared values. We're planning to start a family soon, and our children will grow up in a home where their worth isn't measured by their compliance with predetermined expectations. I have friends who care about me for who I am, not for my family connections or social status. I have work that fulfills me creatively and challenges me professionally. I have financial stability that I built myself, that can't be taken away by anyone's disapproval or ultimatum. I have autonomy and authenticity, the freedom to make choices based on my own values and desires. People who learn about my story often express sympathy or pity. They focus on what I lost, the financial security, the family connections, the inheritance I'll never receive. They ask if I regret my decision or if I've thought about what my life would have been like if I'd made different choices. The truth is, I know exactly what my life would have been like if I'd made different choices. I would have ended my relationship with David and eventually married someone my parents approved of. I would have worked at my father's company or some equivalent position secured through family connections. I would have lived in an expensive house and driven luxury cars and maintained the image of success and status. But I also would have been miserable. I would have spent my whole life living according to someone else's script, making decisions based on what would please my parents or maintain family harmony rather than on what I actually wanted. I would have had financial security but no genuine autonomy. I would have had family relationships but only at the cost of my authentic self. I walked away from my family with nothing but a suitcase and a few $100s. The 5 years since then have been harder in many ways than anything I experienced in my privileged upbringing. I've struggled financially, worked jobs that were beneath my education level, lived in apartments that would have horrified my parents, and dealt with the grief and loss of family estrangement. But I've also discovered who I am outside of my family's expectations. I've built a career based on my own talents and interests. I've created a life that reflects my values rather than values that were imposed on me. I've learned that I'm capable of supporting myself, of making good decisions, of building something meaningful without family money or connections. The cost of my freedom was high, but it was worth paying. The loss of my family relationships was painful, but those relationships were conditional and controlling in ways that were ultimately unsustainable. The financial struggles were real, but they taught me resilience and resourcefulness I never would have developed otherwise. I would make the same choice again without hesitation. If I could go back to that moment when I was 33, facing my parents' ultimatum, knowing everything I know now about how hard the next 5 years would be, I would still choose to walk away. Because the alternative, staying in a gilded cage where my choices and my identity were controlled by family money and expectations, would have been a slower death of the spirit. I walked away from my family with nothing, and I built a life that's genuinely mine. That life isn't perfect, it's not wealthy or glamorous, it doesn't look like success by my parents' standards. But it's authentic and it's fulfilling and it's based on choices I made freely rather than choices that were made for me. To anyone facing a similar decision, trapped between family expectations and personal autonomy, I want you to know that it's possible to choose yourself. It's hard and scary and comes with real costs, but it's possible. You can survive without family money or approval. You can build a life on your own terms. You can discover who you are outside of other people's expectations. I walked away from my family with nothing, and I'd do it again. Not because the relationship wasn't valuable or because I didn't love them, but because loving them couldn't mean sacrificing myself. Not because the money and security weren't tempting, but because no amount of comfort is worth living someone else's life. Not because walking away was easy, but because staying would have been impossible. 5 years later, I'm happy in ways I never was during all those years of privilege and family connection. I'm proud of myself in ways I never could be when everything was given to me rather than earned. I'm free in ways I never was when every choice had to be approved by others. I walked away from my family with nothing, and I gained everything that matters. And I would do it again in a heartbeat.